Have you ever wondered why God chose to respond to Moses with the mysterious phrase, "I am who I am"? Doesn't it seem like an unusual answer to such a simple request? Moses wanted a name, something concrete to present to the people, but God gave him a statement that transcends time and human understanding. What many fail to realize is that this was not just a response. It was a profound revelation about the very nature of the Creator, one that would shape the entire biblical narrative, from Exodus to the New Testament. Now, here's something that might surprise you. This same declaration spoken in the wilderness was later echoed by Jesus Christ centuries later. And when he used the words, "I am," he was not just making a casual statement, he was making a bold claim about his own divinity. This is what made the religious leaders of his time furious, because they knew exactly what he meant. If connecting Moses to Jesus seems like a distant idea, just wait until you see how this relationship is much deeper than most people realize. But why is this revelation so important? Simple, it changes everything. If God is I am, then that means he does not change, that he is eternal, that he is everything we need. In today's world, where everything is uncertain, where promises are broken, and where people seek answers, in all the wrong places, this truth becomes a solid foundation. If you have ever felt fear, insecurity, or uncertainty about your future, understanding the revelation of the divine name can completely transform the way you see life. And here's the most incredible part. This is not just an ancient story. The divine name was not left in the past. It does not belong only to Moses or the Hebrew people. It remains the foundation of faith for millions around the world. If God was I am in Egypt, he is still I am today. If he freed an entire nation from an impossible slavery, what is stopping him from changing your situation right now? But before we jump to conclusions, we need to dive deep into this subject and understand what I am really means and how it directly connects to our lives. The story of Moses, the confrontation with Egypt, and the way Jesus reclaimed this revelation in the New Testament all have deep implications. And once you fully grasp it, you will never look at your faith the same way again. So, are you ready for this journey? Because this revelation may be the key to seeing God in a completely new way. Moses grew up surrounded by the luxury of Egyptian royalty, living among palaces, gold, and a culture that worshipped countless gods. But beneath the garments of a prince, there was an internal conflict. He knew he did not belong to that reality. His blood was Hebrew, his people suffered, and he could not ignore that. One day, the confrontation between these two identities became unbearable. Moses, driven by a sense of justice, took an extreme action and had to flee to Midian. It was there, far from the Egyptian splendor in the arid desert, that his true story began to unfold. Because sometimes it is in isolation that God reveals the divine purpose. And who would have thought that a man who once lived at the heart of Egyptian royalty would become a simple shepherd in the desert? But that's exactly how Moses spent years in Midian, tending flocks, learning patience and humility, things that the royal court could never teach. How many times do we feel out of place, unable to understand why certain doors close? Moses surely wondered the same. He left a place of power only to end up in what seemed like a forgotten exile. But it was precisely this silent journey that was shaping him for the confrontation that lay ahead. Then, the unexpected happened. At the top of a mountain, Moses saw a burning bush, a vision that defied logic. The bush was on fire, yet it was not consumed. Curious, he approached, and at that moment, the divine name was revealed. God called him by name, as if he had always known exactly where Moses was. And not only that, God gave him a clear purpose. The time for anonymity was over. Now he was no longer a runaway prince or a shepherd without direction. He was the chosen one, sent to confront Egypt and free his people. The most striking detail: Moses hesitated. And who wouldn't? Imagine receiving a mission that seemed impossible. To challenge Pharaoh, face the most powerful nation in the world, and lead an entire enslaved people to freedom. Moses tried to escape the responsibility. "Who am I to do this?" he asked. But God was not interested in human insecurity. He had already made his decision. When God calls, he has already prepared everything. Moses' past in Egyptian royalty now made sense. He knew the customs, how to speak with authority, and how the machinery of power worked. But what sealed this mission was the divine name revealed: I am who I am. A declaration that would echo through eternity. God did not introduce himself with an ordinary title or a name confined to human understanding. He proclaimed his absolute sovereignty. For Moses, this revelation meant that he would not walk alone. The confrontation with Pharaoh would not depend on his abilities, but on divine authority. Moses did not need to be strong enough. He only needed to trust. And how many times do we also delay our missions because we think we are not enough? What happened in that encounter on Mount Horeb changed the course of history. God was not just bringing physical liberation, but spiritual redemption for the Hebrew people. Moses was not just a messenger. He was an instrument of the divine plan. The weight of this revelation still echoes today, because centuries later, when Jesus proclaimed, "I am," he was establishing a direct connection to this moment. But before we get there, we need to understand how this divine name was received and the impact it had. At the top of Mount Horeb, surrounded by the silence of the desert, Moses stood before something he could never have imagined. God was speaking to him. But the revelation did not stop at the burning bush. The question Moses asked still echoes today: who should I say sent me? And then came the answer that changed everything: I am who I am. This was not just any response. It was an absolute declaration of existence and sovereignty. God was not merely identifying himself, he was defining his very nature, a being that depends on nothing and no one to exist. While the Egyptian gods required rituals, temples, and offerings, the true God simply exists, eternal and unchanging. This response defied human logic. Egypt was an empire that worshipped hundreds of deities, each with a specific function, one for fertility, another for war, another for the Nile River. But the divine name revealed to Moses was unlike anything that had ever been spoken before. I am needed no qualifications because he was everything: justice, redemption, confrontation, deliverance. In that moment, Moses began to realize that this was not just about negotiating with Pharaoh. He was to be the spokesperson of the Creator himself. Think about the depth of this name. When someone says, I am, they usually follow it with something: I am a teacher, I am a father, I am a leader. But God simply says, I am, because he needs no labels. This means that when we face challenges, he is the strength that sustains us. When we do not know which way to go, he is the direction. When we feel alone, he is the constant presence. This revelation was not just for Moses. It was for anyone who needs to know that God is not limited by human understanding. But Moses still had doubts. How would he convince a nation of enslaved people and a power-hungry Pharaoh with this simple declaration? And this is where God revealed something essential. It was not about Moses, it was about the one who was sending him. When God reveals himself, he does not expect us to rely on our own strength. Moses did not need to be perfect, eloquent, or strong. He only needed to understand that the divine name was enough. How often do we hide behind excuses, believing we are not capable? If God has called you, He has already prepared everything. Centuries later, this same divine revelation would appear in an even more astonishing way. When Jesus said, "I am," he was not using just any phrase. He was claiming his divinity directly, connecting himself to the God who spoke to Moses in the desert. This was a direct confrontation with the religious leaders who rejected him. They understood exactly what he meant, and that is why they wanted to kill him. When someone says, "I am," they are declaring that they have always existed, that they are above time, and that they have supreme authority. And this authority manifests in our lives in unexpected ways. When we face situations that seem impossible, when human answers fail, when we cannot see a way out, this divine name becomes an anchor. Moses received this revelation just before his ultimate confrontation with Pharaoh. He needed to understand that no matter what challenges came, the certainty that God is would be his greatest resource. But was Moses really ready to face the Egyptian empire? The moment had come. Moses, who once fled Egypt as a man without direction, was now returning with an impossible mission by human standards to confront Pharaoh and demand the liberation of an entire people. The scene was almost surreal. How could a shepherd who had spent years in the desert stand before the most powerful leader of that time? But Moses was not returning alone. The divine name revealed to him on Mount Horeb was his greatest weapon. This was not just a political negotiation, it was a battle between God's sovereignty and the arrogance of Egyptian royalty. Pharaoh, considered a god among men, could not easily accept a command that challenged the very foundation of his power. Egypt was not just an empire, it was a civilization built on domination. The Hebrews were the workforce that sustained this system, freedom. That word did not exist in Pharaoh's vocabulary when it came to slaves. The confrontation began with Moses declaring a simple but powerful message. "Thus says the Lord, let my people go." This was the voice of divine authority breaking through centuries of oppression. Pharaoh responded like any ruler accustomed to absolute power. "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice?" His hardened heart symbolized humanity's refusal to submit to God. Egypt prided itself on its royalty, its gods, and its invincible system. But before the true God, none of that had any power. And so the signs and wonders began. The confrontation between God and the arrogance of the empire was about to reach epic proportions. The plagues that followed were not random. Each one directly attacked an aspect of Egyptian culture and its gods. The Nile River, considered sacred, turned into blood. Frogs, a symbol of fertility, infested the land in chaos. Darkness covered Egypt, challenging Ra, the sun god. Every strike was a declaration that the Lord was greater than all the Egyptian deities. Yet, even as his nation crumbled, Pharaoh refused to yield. Human pride always resists what God is revealing. The climax of the confrontation came with the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. This was a direct blow to Egypt's future and, more importantly, to Pharaoh's own house. That night, while Egyptian homes were filled with mourning, the houses of the Hebrews were spared by the blood of the Lamb. This event did not only mark the liberation of the slaves, but it also foreshadowed something much greater, because centuries later, another lamb would shed his blood to bring ultimate redemption. The Exodus was more than a historical event. It was a preview of the salvation to come. In the end, Pharaoh had no choice. Egypt, once indestructible, was in ruins. He released the Hebrews, but his arrogance led him to pursue them to the very last moment. Then the Red Sea parted, and God revealed his power in a final, undeniable way. The same sea that opened for God's people closed over the Egyptian army. The confrontation ended with God's absolute victory. But for the Hebrews, this was just the first step. The true journey was only beginning. and it would take centuries to fully understand its meaning. The story of Moses did not end in the desert, nor with the crossing of the Red Sea. In fact, it echoed through the centuries and reached its climax in the New Testament. What many fail to realize is that the divine name revealed to Moses, "I am who I am," was not just a declaration for the liberation of Israel from Egypt. It pointed to something far greater, something that, over 1,000 years later, Jesus Christ would proclaim in an even more powerful way. When Jesus said, "I am," he was not merely identifying himself. He was making a bold statement about his divinity, directly connecting himself to the God who called Moses from the burning bush. Imagine the impact of these words on the religious leaders of Jesus' time. The Pharisees, who deeply knew the scriptures, were shocked when Jesus declared, "Before Abraham was, I am." This was not a metaphor, nor was it a symbolic statement. It was an absolute claim of divine authority. The same God who delivered Israel from Egypt was now standing before them in human form. The confrontation that had once been between Moses and Pharaoh was now unfolding between Jesus and the religious elite. The difference? This time, the liberation was not just physical, it was eternal. The Passover of the Hebrews, celebrated on the night of the 10th plague, was a foreshadowing of what would happen centuries later. Just as the blood of the Lamb spared the Hebrews from death, the blood of Christ would bring redemption to all of humanity. The Exodus was a deliverance from physical slavery. Jesus brought deliverance from sin and death. Moses led the people to the promised land, but Jesus opened the way to eternal life. What began with the divine name, revealed in the wilderness, found its ultimate fulfillment on the cross of Calvary. But do not think that this connection is limited to liberation alone. Just as Moses was initially rejected by his own people, Jesus also faced rejection. Many did not believe in him, questioned his authority, and even tried to silence him. Moses was sent to confront the greatest empire of his time. Jesus came to confront the empire of sin. The desert where Moses encountered God was the same kind of setting where Jesus spent 40 days fasting, preparing for his mission. The story was repeating itself, but now on an even deeper level. And so, we are left with a question. If the divine name was revealed to Moses for the liberation of Israel, what does it mean for us today? What was Jesus telling us when he declared, "I am"? He was showing us that God has not changed, that he still opens impossible paths, and that he still calls ordinary people for extraordinary missions. The same God who used Moses to challenge Egypt is the one who empowers his people today. The same power that parted the Red Sea is still transforming lives. The connection between Moses and Christ is not just theological, it is practical and real. And if there is one thing this connection teaches us, it is that God does not only reveal himself, he calls people into his purpose. Moses was chosen to free a nation. Jesus came to free the world. But what about you? God still calls people today for seemingly impossible purposes. He still reveals himself in the midst of difficulties and shows his presence in unexpected ways. Moses saw a burning bush. Today, God may reveal himself in different ways, but the call remains the same. The real question is, how many people are truly listening? If there is one thing the divine name revealed to Moses made clear, it is that God does not change. He is not affected by time, does not depend on circumstances, and does not conform to human limitations. When he said, "I am who I am," he was affirming his eternity and immutability. Unlike the Egyptian gods, who were tied to natural elements and subject to change, God has always been and will always be the same. Time passes, empires rise and fall, cultures evolve, but he remains unshaken. This is a concept that challenges human logic. How can something simply exist forever? But that is exactly who the God of the Bible is. And this attribute is not just a theological detail. God's eternity has a direct impact on our lives. Think about how unstable the world is. Today, something is considered true. Tomorrow, it is discarded. Trends change. Even human promises fail. People swear loyalty only to later break their word. But God, He never goes back on what He has promised. What He told Moses thousands of years ago still holds true today. He is not a God who adapts to modern ideologies. He is the unshakable rock. In the middle of life's chaos, having this certainty changes everything. And here's something interesting. If God is immutable, why do so many people live as if He has changed? Some believe that the God of the Old Testament is different from the God of the New Testament, as if He had softened over time. But that is not what Jesus taught. When He said, "I am," He was reaffirming exactly what was revealed to Moses. God is still just, still merciful, still sovereign, and still faithful. The only difference is that in the New Testament, this faithfulness was revealed more deeply through Christ. If God does not change, this means that His promises remain unshaken. The same God who sustained Moses before Pharaoh is the God who sustains you today. He still parts seas, still sets captives free, still guides people through their deserts. When we face challenges, we often act as if God has lost His power. But has He changed? Or have we stopped trusting Him? Look at history. How many times has He proven His power? And how many times have people doubted Him, only to later realize that He remains God? God's immutability also means that His standards do not change. Society may redefine concepts of right and wrong, but God's truth remains. This bothers many people because we want a God who adjusts to our desires, but He does not negotiate His essence. Moses learned this in the desert. When God speaks, He means it, and this applies just as much to His blessings as it does to His warnings. It is no surprise that Jesus was rejected by many. He did not come to say what people wanted to hear, but what they needed to know. And that brings us to a crucial point. If God is eternal and unchanging, then His presence also never abandons us. When difficulties arise, we tend to ask, "Where is God?" But He has never left. He does not abandon us, does not forget us, does not change His mind about us. If Moses could trust Him to face an empire, why do we doubt Him when it comes to our daily struggles? The real issue is not whether God is present. It is whether we are paying attention to what He is doing. And this became even clearer in how He acted throughout the story of redemption. When God revealed His name to Moses, He was not merely establishing His identity. He was making it clear that His very nature was connected to redemption. The name I Am was not just a majestic title, it was a living promise. God is not distant, intangible, or passive. He is the one who sees, who hears, and who acts. From Egypt to the present day, history shows that He has always been committed to rescuing His people, whether from physical slavery or from spiritual bondage. Moses was just the first of many who would be sent to declare this truth. Redemption in the Old Testament was a visible process. God sent signs and wonders, parted seas, and overthrew armies. But all of this pointed to something much greater. In the New Testament, redemption took its ultimate form. God Himself came into the world to free humanity. Just as Moses carried the mission of delivering the Hebrews from oppression, Jesus came to free us from the yoke of sin. And here's a powerful detail. The name I Am appears repeatedly in the words of Christ. He was not just bringing redemption, He was redemption in the flesh. When Jesus declared, "I am the bread of life, I am the light of the world, I am the resurrection and the life," He was echoing the same voice that called Moses from the burning bush. God had not changed. In the desert, He was the provision. For the Hebrews, In Christ, he became the spiritual nourishment that satisfies forever. In Egypt, he brought light in the midst of darkness. In the New Testament, Jesus revealed that this light was now available to all. The divine name was no longer just an abstract concept. It was an invitation to experience true freedom. And what is the difference between Moses and Jesus? Moses was a deliverer sent by God, but Jesus is God the deliverer. Moses brought a redemption that freed the people from a place of slavery, but Jesus brought a redemption that transforms hearts. The Exodus was a great victory, but the cross and the resurrection were the final victory. The blood of the Lamb spared the Hebrews on Passover night, but the blood of Christ spares us eternally from condemnation. Moses' mission was a reflection of what was to come, and the divine name revealed it all along. But what does this mean for us today? Simply put, if God is the same, then his commitment to redemption remains. He still frees, still transforms, still rescues. There are people today trapped in cycles of failure, fear, and despair, thinking there is no way out. But the God who parted the Red Sea still opens impossible doors. The same God who led the Hebrews to a new land is the one who can change any life. He is not just "I was," he still is. And that truth can completely redefine the life of anyone who believes. Ultimately, this revelation puts us face to face with a decision. Moses heard the divine name and followed the call. Jesus declared, "I am," and many rejected him. Redemption is available, but it must be chosen. Just as the Hebrews had to trust God to leave Egypt, each person must trust him to escape spiritual slavery. The question is, who is willing to truly follow the God who is? Because the story does not end here. The meaning of the divine name continues to unfold in every life that is transformed by him. The revelation of the divine name to Moses was a turning point in the history of faith. "I am who I am" was not just an answer to a question, it was a statement that would echo through all eternity. The impact of this declaration went far beyond the desert, transcended centuries, and reached our present time. But what does this mean for us today? Many people imagine God as distant, someone who acted in the past but is no longer actively present. However, the divine name itself contradicts that idea. God is not "I was" or "I will be." He is right now in the present, as real and active as he was in the days of Moses. And here's a powerful truth. The way God revealed himself not only emphasizes his eternity, but also reminds us that he is sufficient. When God says "I am," he is showing us that everything we need is found in him. The world pushes us to seek security in money, success, and recognition, but all of these things are temporary. The divine name teaches us that true stability is in God. He does not just provide, he is provision. He does not just give strength, he is strength. Whatever you lack, God already is the answer. Now consider how Jesus used this same expression in the New Testament. He said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the door. I am the good shepherd." Each of these statements carries a practical and profound meaning. This is not just an abstract concept. It is an invitation to a personal relationship with God. When Jesus said, "I am the light of the world," he was directly connecting himself to the divine name revealed in Exodus, showing that the same light that guided the Hebrews through the wilderness was now available to all humanity. And how does this impact daily life? In a massive way. When Moses heard this name, he was filled with doubts and fears. When Jesus proclaimed this name, many tried to reject him. And today, the question remains, how do we respond to the revelation of who God truly is? Do we trust him as the "I am," or do we keep looking for answers elsewhere? The truth is that understanding this name changes our perspective. When we realize that God is unchanging, eternal, and sufficient, our fears shrink, our worries lose power, and our faith strengthens. But there is a challenge here. Recognizing who God is requires that we trust what he does. Moses had to believe that God was capable of freeing Israel. The disciples had to believe that Jesus was truly the Son of God. And what about us? We need to believe that he still is everything we need, even when circumstances tell us otherwise. When chaos strikes, when difficulties come, his answer remains the same: I am. No matter the situation, he is still God. This truth is not just theoretical. It is the foundation for a real and practical life of faith. Those who understand the meaning of the divine name do not live as victims of their circumstances. Those who grasp that God is walk with confidence, knowing that nothing can shake his sovereignty. The final question then is, if God has revealed himself as I am, how does that change your life? Because the story of redemption did not stop in Egypt. It continues in every person who decides to trust in this truth. Now that you understand the meaning of I am who I am, here's the real question. How does this revelation impact your life today? Because it's not enough just to know this truth. What truly matters is how you respond to it. Moses heard this revelation and had to make a decision. Would he trust God or continue running? And what about you? Will you keep trying to handle everything on your own, or will you recognize that God is everything you need? The undeniable truth is that God has not changed. The same I am who parted the Red Sea still makes a way where there is none. The same I am who sustained the Hebrews in the desert still provides for his people today. The same I am that Jesus declared is still the answer for a lost world. Yet the reality is that many people live as if God is not enough. They place their security in money, achievements, and relationships, forgetting that he is the only unshakable foundation. So let me ask you, do you truly believe that God is enough for you? If his name means that he is everything, then that means nothing is impossible for him. If you need direction, he is the way. If you need peace, he is peace. If you feel alone, he is the constant presence. This name is not just a theological idea, it's a practical truth, but it only manifests in the lives of those who believe. So, here's the final question. Are you willing to live as someone who fully trusts the I am? Now, I want to challenge you. Look at your life and ask yourself, where am I trying to handle things on my own instead of trusting God? What would you do differently if you truly believed that he is enough? Moses had to take a step of faith to see the supernatural happen. You also need to take that step. What is God asking you to trust him with today? If this content has spoken to you and opened your eyes to something you hadn't realized before, don't keep this knowledge to yourself. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and continue learning powerful truths like this one. Because understanding who God truly is can change everything, but only for those who choose to dive deeper into this journey.